There is a detail buried inside the book of Deuteronomy that most readers pass over in 3 seconds. It sits between laws about weights and measures and the appointment of judges, and it does not look, at first glance, like the most urgent sentence in the Old Testament. But once you see it in its proper context, once you understand who wrote it, who was listening, and what had just happened to them in the wilderness, the verse stops being a historical footnote and becomes a forensic indictment. The sentence reads, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt." Moses is dying. He is summarizing 40 years of wandering to a generation that was mostly born in the desert. He has one last chance to say what matters. And with the promised land visible on the horizon, he looks backward. He does not look backward at Pharaoh. He does not rehearse the plagues. He tells them to remember Amalek. If we want to understand why, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of a lineage. We have to read the names that people skim. The story of the Amalekites does not begin in the wilderness. It begins in a tent in Canaan, in the family of a man named Esau. Esau, the elder twin of Jacob, the man who sold his birthright for a bowl of stew, the man whose blessing was stolen by his brother while he was out hunting. The text of Genesis does not psychologize Esau extensively, but it gives you enough. Esau is described as a man of the field, impulsive, present tense in his orientation to the world. He despises his birthright before he sells it. That is not a man who traded something thoughtlessly in a moment of weakness. That is a man who had already decided that the long covenant with a God who makes promises across centuries was not worth the price of self-discipline today. The author of Hebrews will later call Esau a profane person, using the Greek word that means someone for whom nothing is set apart, someone who sees no difference between the sacred and the mundane, who will always choose the immediate over the eternal. That disposition does not die with Esau. It travels through his bloodline. Esau fathers a son named Eliphaz. Eliphaz takes a concubine named Timnah. Timnah bears a son named Amalek. And here, in the third generation below Esau, the tribe is born. The Amalekites are, from their very first appearance in the genealogies of Genesis 36, the children of the profane. They are not the children of a broken covenant made under duress. They are the children of a man who decided, deliberately and repeatedly, that the promises of God were not worth honoring. Amalek inherits that orientation. And what does a people look like when they organize themselves around the conviction that nothing is sacred, that there is no God watching, that the strong may do anything to the weak because the universe has no moral architecture? Look at what they did at Rephidim. The exodus from Egypt has been completed. The Red Sea is behind the Israelites. The army of Pharaoh is at the bottom of that sea. The people are moving through the Sinai Peninsula, a massive column of refugees, former slaves who have never organized themselves militarily, who are carrying children and livestock and everything they own. They are exhausted. They are hungry. They are disoriented. They are, in the language of military analysis, a soft target of historic proportions. It is at precisely this moment that Amalek attacks. But the way Amalek attacks is the detail that Moses cannot let Israel forget. Deuteronomy 25 is specific. Amalek did not ride down the front of the column to engage the armed men of fighting age. He attacked the tail. He cut off those who were lagging behind, all who were faint and weary, when Moses was faint and weary himself. There is a Hebrew phrase here, Lo Yar Elohim, he did not fear God. The text does not tell us Amalek was brave. It does not tell us Amalek was strong. It tells us Amalek was without the fear of God. What Amalek did at Rephidim was not warfare. It was predation. It was the deliberate targeting of the slowest, the oldest, the most exhausted members of a population at the moment of their maximum vulnerability. This is not the strategy of a people who saw themselves as enemies of a rival army. This is the strategy of a people who saw their prey as prey. Moses stands on a hill overlooking the valley where Joshua is fighting, and he lifts his hands. When his hands are raised, Israel prevails. When his hands fall, Amalek prevails. Aaron and Hur come alongside him, one on each side, and they hold his arms up until the sun goes down. Israel wins. But what happens next is what this entire investigation is about. God does not congratulate Moses on the victory and move on. He dictates something. He tells Moses to write it in a book, to recite it in the hearing of Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And then Moses builds an altar and names it. The name of the altar is Adonai Nissi, the Lord is my banner. And Moses speaks a declaration over the altar that the translators render in English as a war of the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation. The Hebrew underneath that phrase is critical. The word translated as generation is door. Used twice. Door to door. The decree is not a tactical directive for one campaign. It is a covenantal statement about the character of Amalek across all of history. God is announcing that what happened at Rephidim was not a border dispute. It was a revelation of nature. Amalek has shown what it is. And what it is cannot be reformed, cannot be incorporated, cannot be left partially alive without creating a future catastrophe. The decree is called, in Hebrew legal and ritual language, cherem. The word means devoted to destruction, consecrated to removal. It is not anger. It is a legal verdict following an irrefutable record of evidence. For 400 years, Israel and Amalek clash at various points in the historical narrative. The Amalekites appear in the Judges period, in the time of Gideon, in the raids against Israel. They are persistent. They are recurrent. They are always attacking from the margins, always finding the moment of weakness. And then, in the 11th century before Christ, God brings the mandate of Rephidim to a specific and final execution. The prophet Samuel comes to King Saul with the clearest military order in the entire Old Testament. Go and attack Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them. Kill man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. There is no ambiguity in this command. The word translated as devote to destruction is cherem, the same word from the altar at Rephidim. Saul knows what he is being asked to do. He has heard the story of Rephidim. He has read the decree. He goes. He wins. And then he does not finish. Saul destroys what he deems worthless and despicable. But he spares Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He spares the best of the sheep, the best of the cattle, the best of the fattened calves and the lambs. His justification is theological. He kept them to sacrifice to God. He kept what God commanded him to destroy in order, he says, to honor God. Samuel's response to this is one of the most penetrating lines in all of the prophetic literature. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Samuel is making an epistemological point. Saul has decided that he understands the will of God better than the explicit word of God. He has substituted his own theological creativity for plain obedience. He has used the vocabulary of worship to cover what is, in reality, self-interest. The best animals were also, presumably, the most economically valuable. The logic of keeping them for sacrifice happens to align precisely with the logic of keeping them for profit. Samuel sees through it in one sentence. Partial obedience is not obedience. Partial obedience is a performance of obedience designed to avoid the cost of actual obedience. Saul repents, but the consequences are already in motion. Samuel executes Agag himself. The Amalekite king dies. But what Samuel does not know, what no one in that moment knows, is whether Agag left something behind. Ancient Near Eastern kings did not travel to war alone. The royal household traveled with the army. And the text does not give us a complete account of who else was taken at Carmel. There may have been women. There may have been children. There may have been, in the chaos of a military engagement followed by Saul's unauthorized mercy, survivors who slipped through the net that Saul cut a hole in. Move forward now. Move forward 5 centuries. You are in the imperial capital of Persia, in the court of Xerxes, which the Hebrew text calls Ahasuerus. The Persian Empire at this moment is the largest political entity the ancient world has ever seen. It stretches from India to Ethiopia. And in the administrative hierarchy of this empire, there is a man named Haman. Haman's genealogy is given to us in the book of Esther with the precision of an indictment. He is Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. The text does not say Haman the Persian. It does not identify him by his administrative title or his city of origin. It identifies him by his blood. The name Agag was the dynastic name of the Amalekite kings. Haman is a descendant of the royal house that Saul spared. The exact mechanism of that survival across 5 centuries is not given to us, and we are not required to provide a seamless genealogical chart. What the text is requiring us to notice is the theological pattern. The thing Saul refused to finish has arrived at the center of world power. The thing Saul thought he could manage has metastasized. Now place Mordecai next to Haman. Mordecai is a Benjaminite. His genealogy is also given to us in Esther with precision. He is the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. Kish was the father of Saul. Mordecai is a descendant of the same man who failed to execute the mandate at Carmel. You now have, in the court of Persia, a descendant of the Amalekite king facing off against a descendant of the Israelite king who spared him. The unfinished business of a single afternoon of partial obedience 500 years earlier has reconstituted itself in the palace of the most powerful monarch on earth, and it has brought with it a decree of genocide. Haman, offended because Mordecai will not bow to him, does not respond by having Mordecai punished. He responds by drafting an edict to exterminate every Jewish person in the Persian Empire. The number of people under threat from Haman's decree encompasses, at this moment in history, virtually the entire surviving population of the Jewish people. Babylon has already taken them. They are dispersed across the Persian world. There is no political refuge. There is no army. There is no king in Jerusalem. There is no temple. If Haman succeeds, there is no people. If there is no people, there is no Messiah. If there is no Messiah, the entire redemptive thread of human history is severed in a single afternoon of paperwork in the court of Xerxes. This is the mathematics of partial obedience. One king kept one enemy alive to sacrifice the best of his flock to God. And 5 centuries later, that decision arrives at the door of human extinction. The logic is relentless. When God identifies something as cherem, as devoted to destruction, as carrying within its nature the perpetual disposition to destroy what is sacred, he is not being extreme. He is being surgical. He is cutting out a cancer before it metastasizes. Saul's mercy was not mercy. It was the displacement of a divine verdict by a human sentiment that masqueraded as piety. There is a modern reader who objects to this entire framework. The objection usually sounds like this: how can God command the destruction of an entire people? Is there not something monstrous about a decree that encompasses the innocent? The question is morally serious and deserves a morally serious answer. The decree against Amalek was not issued in the heat of Rephidim. It was issued after the evidence was complete. What Amalek did was not reactionary. It was predatory, deliberate, and unprovoked. It was directed specifically at the weakest members of a population that had just been liberated from 400 years of slavery. And Amalek did not do it once. The pattern repeated across 4 centuries of Israelite history. Every time Israel was at its weakest, Amalek was there at the tail, cutting them down. The decree is not the response of a God who lost his temper. It is the response of a judge who watched the evidence accumulate across generations and issued a verdict that matched the depth of the offense. The theological weight of cherem is that it treats certain acts not as crimes to be punished but as natures to be extinguished, because the nature in question has no mechanism for reformation. Amalek is never in the text depicted as a people who could have been evangelized, incorporated, or converted. Every textual encounter they have with Israel is an act of predation. The decree is the legal response to that consistent record. Now the investigation must turn personal. This is the zone of the script where history becomes a mirror. The question that Saul's failure generates is this: where is the Agag you left alive? Not the abstract theological question. The specific, forensic, uncomfortable one. There is a pattern in your life, in your character, in your spiritual biography, that you have confronted. You have addressed it. You have fought it to a draw and declared the battle won. You have kept the best parts of it because you told yourself you could still use those parts for something good. You have, in Saul's language, kept the best of the sheep to sacrifice to God. You have taken a destructive pattern of behavior, stripped out the most visible and embarrassing components, and kept the underlying structure alive because it is still useful, still comfortable, still generating something you value. And you have given that decision a theological justification. You are keeping it, you say, because you plan to do something good with it eventually. Samuel's question cuts through this in a single sentence. To obey is better than sacrifice. The partial breaking of a destructive pattern is not the breaking of a destructive pattern. It is the management of one. And managed patterns do not stay managed. They reproduce. They resurface. They send descendants into the courts of Persia. The question is not whether you have fought Amalek. The question is whether you finished. The question is not whether you have repented of the most visible expressions of a particular besetting sin or relational dysfunction or theological compromise. The question is whether you have executed the mandate all the way to Agag. Because whatever you spare will eventually draft a decree against everything you love. This is where the script arrives at the only place it can honestly go. Because the honest reader, having sat with this material, will recognize that the problem of Agag is not ultimately a problem that human obedience can solve. Saul failed. Not because he was uniquely wicked, but because he was human. Every human king in this narrative fails the cherem mandate in some way. The pattern of partial obedience is not a Saulite dysfunction. It is the Adamic condition. We always spare something. We always keep something back. We always find a theological justification for the enemy we could not quite bring ourselves to finish. This is precisely the problem that the Messiah comes to solve. Jesus Christ enters the narrative as the king from the tribe of Judah who will succeed where every previous king failed. And the language of his completion is strikingly absolute. On the cross, his final words in the Gospel of John are not a prayer request or a statement of doctrine. They are a declaration of finished work. It is finished. The Greek word is tetelestai, a commercial term meaning paid in full, completed, nothing remaining outstanding. This is not the language of a man who kept the best of the sheep. This is the language of a king who executed the mandate completely. The war against sin, death, and the spiritual powers of darkness is not managed by Christ. It is finished by Christ. He does not negotiate with the principality. He does not spare the comfortable version of the enemy. He goes all the way to the cross and through the grave, and he comes out the other side having left nothing incomplete. The contrast between Saul and Jesus is the contrast between the best human religious effort and the obedience of the Son of God. Saul's partial obedience produced 5 centuries of compounding danger and a near-extinction event. Christ's perfect obedience produces the complete defeat of the last enemy, which is death itself. And because his obedience was complete, the power available to the follower of Christ is not the power to manage sin but the power to be freed from it. The Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead does not negotiate with Amalek. It does not keep the best of the sheep. It is the completion, applied to the interior life, of what Christ accomplished on the cross. This is the investigative thread we have been following from a tent in Canaan, through a desert attack in the Sinai, through a battlefield near Carmel, through 5 centuries of compounding consequence, into the court of Xerxes, into the palace where Esther stands before the king, and finally onto a cross outside Jerusalem. The thread is the same thread from beginning to end. What happens when obedience is partial, and what it costs to make it complete. The question this leaves you with is not rhetorical. It is an assignment. You know the zone. You already identified it while we were in the section about Saul. You know the area of your life where you fought, and mostly won, and kept something alive because it was useful. The question is not whether that area exists. The question is what you are going to do about it first, this week, before the descendants of what you spared have time to draft their own decree. Next time, we are going to follow a different thread. We are going to go to the moment when God's silence in an entire biblical book is not the absence of God but the most concentrated theological argument in all of Scripture. The book of Esther does not mention the name of God once. That is not an omission. That is a sermon. And we are going to investigate every word of it.